Hello my wonderful viewers, we are here again.
Let me go.
Sorry if you think this story is going
Forgive
longer,
me, please.
but I am trying to give you guys the details in fullest.
Please,
Comment where in the
let me
world you
go.
are watching from. Now let's swim.
Forgive me,
How
please.
many times can one awaken in the same nightmare? Mary asked herself that without words, only through the pounding in her chest as her eyes flickered open. The air was thick with the familiar smell of candle wax and oil, a smell she had prayed never to inhale again. She was in the prayer room, but it wasn't the ruined one she had escaped. The walls were freshly painted, a pale cream, and the carved wooden cross above the altar gleamed as though oiled only moments ago. The candles on the floor were new, their flames steady, their light almost too bright. Mary sat frozen on the mat, clutching her knees, the silence pressing on her ears like a heavy hand. Outside the closed door she could hear faint murmurs, dozens of voices blending into the hum of prayer. The sound wasn't chaotic, it was rhythmic, patterned, like a chant rising and falling as one. Her breath caught when she realized what chilled her most. The voices sounded familiar. They sounded like the very women whose faces she had seen in the flames back in the chapel. The ones who had screamed without sound. Mary pressed her palms against her ears, but the chant only seemed to grow louder inside her skull. She stumbled to her feet, swaying on trembling legs, her eyes darting to the door. It was closed but not locked, its handle polished smooth as though touched 1,000 times in reverence. Just as she reached for it, a voice, low and steady, slid into the room like smoke. "You always find your way back here." Mary turned, her blood running cold. He wasn't Daniel, at least not in face. The man before her was taller, thinner, his robe off-white and unadorned, his eyes calm. Yet when he smiled, her stomach turned because she had seen that smile before. The same cruelty that hid behind gentleness. The same crimson flicker deep in the pupils. He didn't rush her, didn't raise his voice. He simply lifted a weathered leather-bound book from the altar and laid it across his arms like an offering. "Your page is not finished," he said softly. "And the covenant doesn't forget." Mary's breath shuddered out of her as her hand slipped from the doorknob. For the first time, she wondered not how to escape the prayer room, but if the prayer room itself was alive, and if she had been swallowed whole. The night had barely broken into morning when Mary found herself stumbling through the damp bush path, her legs still trembling from the suffocating presence of the prayer room. The air smelled of dew and wood smoke, and as she pushed past the thick leaves, she saw it, a small fire crackling in the clearing ahead. Around it sat 3 villagers, their faces carved by grief more than age. A woman with deep lines around her eyes cradled a gourd of water, her wrapper hanging loosely on her thin frame. She spoke in a low voice, telling of her younger sister who had vanished after bringing home a certificate signed by a shepherd in Port Harcourt. "They said it was for her salvation," she whispered, staring at the ground, "but what kind of salvation steals your body and leaves your voice in the wind?" The man beside her, his arm scarred from an old fire, added another story, one about a church in Kaduna where an entire choir of women disappeared during service, their hymn ending in silence that still haunted him. Mary's throat tightened as she listened, because their stories wove too easily into her own. Every certificate, every ritual, every whispered promise, all roads led back to the same darkness. And for the first time, she understood she wasn't alone in her terror. This wasn't about one man named Daniel Grace. This was an order. A covenant. And it stretched across lands and generations. When the woman's voice cracked into silence and the fire hissed low, Mary felt eyes on her. She turned, and at the edge of the clearing, half in shadow, stood a tall, gaunt man with a long coat that swayed against his legs. His face was narrow, his cheekbones sharp, his skin pale brown like someone who carried both the sun and another land in his blood. For a while he said nothing, only watching her, the firelight flickering in his deep-set eyes. When the others dispersed into the dawn, leaving only smoke and silence, he stepped closer. His footsteps were deliberate, his presence unsettling, yet strangely measured. He stopped just outside the circle of fading light and spoke with a voice low and hoarse, as though it had weathered years of dust and prayer. "Mary Collins." Hearing her name fall from a stranger's lips made her chest seize. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cracking in the cool air. He set down a weathered leather satchel by the fire, his fingers brushing a rosary that hung loosely from his pocket. "I am Reverend Elijah Kane," he said. "I have hunted the shepherd since before you were born." His gaze sharpened, and with a quiet certainty that chilled her, he added, "Your name is not only in his book, Mary. It is in all of them." The first light of dawn broke gently across the trees, streaking the bush path in gold as Reverend Elijah Kane motioned for Mary to follow him. He walked with a strange discipline, every step steady, his worn boots crunching softly against the earth. Without a word, he led her to a stream not far from the clearing, where water trickled over smooth stones, clear and cold in the morning air. He knelt by the edge, rolling up the sleeves of his weathered coat, and dipped his hands in. "Wash," he said simply, his voice husky with years of dust and travel. Mary hesitated but obeyed, plunging her trembling fingers into the icy stream. The shock of it sent a shiver up her arms. "I do this," Elijah explained, his eyes fixed on the current, "in every place where their shadow lingers. It doesn't erase the stain, but it reminds me I'm still human." He paused, letting the water slip through his fingers. "In Enugu, I found them," he continued, his tone low and bitter. "Bodies drifting downstream, each clutching their certificates like lifelines. The ink was still fresh, though the faces were already cold." Mary flinched, pulling her hands quickly from the water as if it could burn. Her stomach turned at the image, but she said nothing. She didn't trust this stranger yet, though part of her recognized the same haunted weight in his voice that had begun to settle in her own. When they returned to the dying fire, Elijah set his leather satchel on a flat stone and opened it with careful hands. Inside lay a journal thick with notes, pages swollen from weather, ink blurred but legible. He flipped it open, spreading it across his lap, and Mary caught glimpses of maps marked with crosses, sketches of symbols that looked too precise to be casual drawings. "The shepherds are not men of one village or one season," Elijah said, his gaze locked on the ink. "They are a chain. Each one inherits the vow. Each one keeps a ledger. And each ledger feeds the covenant." His words carried the weight of someone who had repeated them too many times. Mary leaned closer despite herself, eyes scanning the names that filled the yellowed pages. Some she recognized from whispers in her town. Others were foreign, places and people she had never heard of. Her heart stumbled in her chest when Elijah turned a page lined in red ink. At the very top, in clean, sharp handwriting, was her name, Mary Collins. Beneath it were words that made her stomach drop, "bound before birth." She staggered back, shaking her head. "No. That's not possible." Elijah's eyes lifted to hers, steady, unflinching. "It is not only possible. It is the reason you are here. They have been waiting for you longer than you can imagine." Mary's throat tightened, her breath shallow. For the first time since this began, she realized she wasn't just caught in someone else's snare, she was part of the design itself. The rain had fallen briefly that afternoon, leaving the earth soft underfoot and the air thick with the smell of wet leaves. Mary and Elijah moved slowly through the ruins of the mission yard, the drizzle clinging to their clothes. Elijah stopped suddenly and crouched beside an old well covered in vines, brushing the moss away with the back of his hand. "Every shepherd leaves more than prayers behind," he muttered. "They bury their truths under stone." Mary frowned, her arms folded tight against her chest. "Stone doesn't whisper," she said. "But I hear them still." Elijah's sharp eyes flicked toward her, a faint acknowledgement, before he pushed against the vine-covered slab. It groaned open, revealing a staircase of mud and stone, damp and echoing with the slow drip of water below. Before they could descend, a voice rang from the trees, "You'll find more than ghosts down there." Mary spun, her heart jolting. A woman stepped into view, tall, broad-shouldered, her wrapper clinging wet against her frame, her jaw marked by a scar. Her eyes carried the heavy weight of survival. Ngozi Awele, she said flatly, as though her name alone was proof of her presence. Elijah straightened, studying her warily. Mary saw in his face both recognition and mistrust. Ngozi stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Mary. "You think you are the first to hold their book?" she asked bitterly. "I lost my husband to one. And if you're going down there, you should know, not everything buried stays silent." The steps were slick, each one taking them deeper into the cold belly of the mission house. The three of them descended in silence, the only sounds their breaths and the echo of dripping water. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber. The air was thick with mildew, but beneath it was another smell: dry parchment, old ink, the metallic tang of rusted chains. Mary's eyes widened. Dozens of wooden tables filled the chamber, stacked high with blank certificates, each trimmed in gold leaf, waiting to be written. Against the far wall, rows of iron shelves held ledgers bound in cracked leather, their spines marked with strange symbols. Shackles hung from the ceiling like cruel ornaments. Mary's stomach turned at the sight, her pulse racing in her ears. She stepped forward, running her trembling hand across the surface of one ledger, feeling the faint warmth radiating from it as though it were alive. "This," Elijah whispered, his voice carrying both awe and fury, "is the root. Every shepherd feeds from here." But before Mary could respond, Ngozi's voice cut through the silence. "Then know this," she said, her face shadowed in the dim light. "If you destroy one, you destroy every soul tied to it, even the ones you love." Mary froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her mother's humming returned to her mind, low and deep, like a warning. And in that moment, she realized the covenant's shadow wasn't just about Daniel. It was about every name, past, present, and future, chained to these books. The chamber's silence felt wrong, too heavy, like a breath being held beneath the earth. Mary ran her palm along the spine of one ledger, the leather strangely warm, her skin prickling as if the book itself could feel her touch. Beside her, Elijah scribbled notes into his battered journal, muttering half-formed prayers, while Ngozi paced like a caged lioness, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I told you," Ngozi said sharply, her scar catching the dim lamplight. "These books are bound to the dead. Burn them, and the names tied to them burn too." Mary opened her mouth to reply, but stopped. There was a sound, faint, deliberate, like wood shifting under weight. Elijah froze, the pencil in his hand snapping. "We're not alone," he whispered. The air grew colder, though the lantern's flame burned steady. Then the sound came again, a heavy, deliberate thud. Mary's heart pounded as shadows thickened at the far end of the chamber. Slowly, two figures stepped into view. The first was tall, impossibly tall, his thin body draped in a dark robe, his face stretched and narrow, eyes hollow yet faintly glowing red. The second walked hunched, shorter but broader, his broken nose twisted across his face, his crooked smile unsettling. Their footsteps were in sync, slow and certain, echoing against the stone walls. Elijah inhaled sharply. "The twins," he murmured. "Covenant enforcers." Mary stumbled back, clutching the ledger to her chest, her pulse hammering. The taller twin spoke first, his voice a thin hiss, yet it carried perfectly across the chamber. "A book is not yours to touch, girl." The shorter twin finished the sentence without pause, his deeper growl overlapping, "And yet here you stand, binding yourself tighter with every page." Their eyes glowed brighter, and in the dim light Mary saw something worse, faint outlines of chains, spectral and writhing, coiled around their arms and stretching back into the shadows. Ngozi stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "You monsters took my husband," she spat, her voice cracking with rage. "Then come for me now if you dare." The twins tilted their heads in eerie unison, as if studying her with curiosity. Then, without warning, the chamber trembled. One of the shelves collapsed, scattering certificates across the floor like leaves in a storm. Candles flared violently, their flames bending toward Mary as though drawn to her. Elijah grabbed her wrist, his voice urgent. Run! The twins' voices rose together, chanting in a tongue that vibrated through the stone, and the chamber erupted in heat. Fire licked the edges of the ledgers, not consuming but illuminating the names in a glow too bright for human eyes. Mary ran with the others toward the narrow staircase, the roar of flames and the sound of the twins' voices crashing behind her like a tide. Her lungs burned, but even as she climbed, she heard them, calm, certain, and in unison, "You cannot flee the covenant, Mary Collins. You are its bride." The night sky above Kimber glowed red as if the earth itself was bleeding into the heavens. Mary stumbled out of the mission house ruins, lungs burning, her hair damp with sweat, the stench of smoke clinging to her wrapper. Elijah and Ngozi collapsed beside her, their breaths ragged, the chamber's roar still echoing in their ears. For a fleeting moment, the silence felt like freedom. But then came the sound, low, familiar, and unbearable. A humming. Mary froze, her head whipping toward the shadows at the tree line. Her mother stepped forward slowly, Grace Collins, her wrapper clutched loosely around her shoulders, her lips moving in that same dreadful hymn. Only now it was louder, stronger, layered with a voice that wasn't hers. "Mama," Mary whispered, her chest seizing with grief. Grace's eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and her hands shook as if something pulled her strings from within. Elijah rose shakily, his jaw tight. "She's tethered," he said. "Her soul bound into the ledger." Ngozi spat bitterly, "I told you. Destroy the book, and she burns with it." Mary's knees buckled as the weight of it crushed her. The truth that her mother's body wasn't her own anymore, that her salvation was shackled to the covenant's survival. The hymn rose louder, joined by whispers swelling from the wind itself, until the trees seemed to murmur in unison. And then, through the smoke, he appeared. Pastor Daniel Grace. Alive. Whole. His robe was pure, his skin unmarked, his smile calm and terrible. He carried a fresh ledger under one arm, the iron clasps gleaming, as if newly forged. "You still do not understand," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the clearing. Mary staggered back, clutching her chest, but his gaze pinned her like chains. "This is not about me. It has never been about me." He lifted the ledger slightly, the gold-edged pages fluttering though there was no wind. "The covenant writes itself. You are not its victim, Mary Collins. You are its bride." Her heart lurched, bile rising in her throat as the words settled like poison. Elijah stepped forward, raising a trembling hand, his rosary swinging. "Lies," he growled, though his voice faltered. "She is no bride. She is a prisoner." Daniel's smile widened, his crimson eyes glowing brighter. "A prisoner does not awaken in the room of vows, Reverend Kane. A bride does." Behind Mary, Grace's humming grew frantic, her hands reaching out as though begging to be freed. Mary's tears blurred her vision as she stared between her mother's trembling body, the flames that licked the horizon, and the ledger in Daniel's grasp. Every path cut her open, destroy the book and lose her mother forever, or keep it and let the covenant thrive through her. For the first time, Mary felt her faith crumble under the weight of choice. Her lips parted, trembling, but no words came. Daniel extended his hand gently, almost tenderly. "It is time for the vow." The last sound before the chapter ends is the slam of the ledger's clasp. Wow! Dear viewers, how are you feeling? Subscribe and turn on the notification buttons for more.